So, King Charles III chose Meghan Markle's 45th birthday to detonate what can only be described as a legal grenade directly at his youngest son. And depending on which side of this family you sympathize with, the degree of calculation involved is either deeply unsettling or grudgingly admirable. Because while the entire world had its eyes locked on the Duchess of Sussex celebrating in Montecito, debating whether her lifestyle brand was finally gaining traction, the quiet machinery of the British monarchy was executing something that makes every Netflix documentary and bombshell memoir look like a minor schoolyard disagreement. This isn't a story about who reduced whom to tears before a royal wedding or who said something cutting at a private dinner. This is about a king seated at Sandringham with a fountain pen methodically dismantling and rebuilding the entire financial and legal skeleton of the House of Windsor, specifically to permanently exclude anyone who has chosen to make their home outside the British Isles. And the truly staggering element is that he accomplished it by invoking an emergency constitutional provision that virtually nobody outside a very tight circle of palace lawyers even knew remained on the books. So let's walk through exactly what happened, because the specifics matter and the sequence of events is genuinely extraordinary. In the early days of August 2026, while global media was completely consumed with birthday coverage of the Duchess of Sussex and the usual speculation about whether the royal family would publicly acknowledge the occasion, King Charles was at Sandringham executing something called a courtesan. Now this sounds like it belongs on a restaurant menu, but it's actually an emergency constitutional mechanism that permits the sovereign to unilaterally restructure non-crown assets without seeking parliamentary approval or cabinet consultation. Think of it as the legal equivalent of simultaneously triggering every fire door in a building. Everything locks at once and nobody gets through without authorization. The mechanism exists for moments when the monarch concludes that an institutional crisis is too urgent to wait for the usual deliberative channels, and Charles determined that August 2026 qualified as exactly that kind of moment. The timing was deliberate. By choosing a window when the news cycle was already drowning in birthday content, the administrative filing would land quietly rather than explosively. Nobody was scanning the court circular. Nobody was monitoring trust registries. The world was watching California, which was precisely where the palace needed their attention to remain. What the courtesan actually accomplishes is where the legal strategy becomes genuinely fascinating. Charles didn't simply restrict access to money. He reconstructed the entire inheritance framework around one devastating central clause. Any beneficiary who maintains primary residency outside the British Isles for 5 consecutive years is now automatically barred from accessing the core capital principle of the trusts originally established in 1994. That 5-year figure isn't arbitrary. It maps precisely onto Prince Harry's departure from active royal duties in 2020. By the moment this document was formally executed, Harry had been residing in California for approximately 6 years. The arithmetic is deliberate. The cutoff is retroactive in effect, even if technically framed in forward-looking language. And the genuinely sophisticated element, if one can apply that word to a father legally severing financial ties with his son, is that this reframes the entire situation from a family quarrel into a matter of cold, objective statutory law. There is no opening for emotional argument. There is no space for negotiation. There is no conversation that undoes it. The trust either applies based on where you reside or it doesn't. And if you chose to build your life in Montecito, it doesn't. But Charles didn't confine himself to the money, which is honestly where this escalates from financial restructuring into something that resembles a comprehensive legal siege. The courtesan also covers physical property, specifically items designated for decades as eventually passing to the descendants of Princess Diana. One particular piece apparently drew concentrated focus from the palace legal team, a diamond and ruby tiara originally presented to Diana by a foreign head of state sometime during the 1980s. For years, it was understood within the family that this piece was intended ultimately for Harry's children or grandchildren. Under the revised legal framework, the palace reclassified this item as an official diplomatic gift rather than personal property. That distinction carries enormous weight. A diplomatic gift belongs to the state, not to any individual. It gets transferred into the Tower of London collection. It cannot be exported, inherited, or used as private financial collateral. And once an item enters the state collection under that classification, reversing it is functionally impossible. The legal threshold for challenging such a designation would require demonstrating that the original classification was fraudulent, and that isn't happening when the sovereign personally authorized it. The archive seizure may actually be the most aggressive element of all, and that's saying something given how extraordinary the tiara reclassification already is. Embedded within the codicil is a specific footnote addressing personal correspondence written by Prince Harry during his years at Eton College. These letters are stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Sandringham Library, a sentence that genuinely sounds like it belongs in a Gothic novel, but stay with me. The document formally transfers legal copyright over these private writings to the office of the Prince of Wales. Under property law, the physical custodian of personal correspondence holds significant legal leverage, even if the original author retains certain publication rights. In practical terms, this means any future memoir, documentary project, or public venture that draws on descriptions of early family life or references content from those letters now requires clearance from William's office. The palace didn't simply secure the vault. They secured the intellectual property rights to Harry's own teenage words. That isn't a financial maneuver. That's narrative control, and it's permanent. The non-disclosure mechanism woven into the codicil is where the trap closes completely. The text explicitly provides that any legal challenge filed against this amendment by a disqualified beneficiary will automatically trigger the full public release of every private financial audit related to that beneficiary's post-royal commercial activities. So, here is the position the California household now occupies. Accept the restructuring in complete silence, permanently surrender access to the trust capital, and move forward with life as it is. Or challenge it in court, at which point every business arrangement, every partnership deal, every revenue stream, the Netflix agreement, the book advance, the speaking circuit, becomes subject to public discovery. The palace has effectively embedded a gag order inside property law. You want to contest the inheritance? The act of contesting it exposes your entire financial operation to public examination. That isn't a legal strategy built to succeed in court. That's a legal strategy engineered to ensure court never happens. It's checkmate written in trust language. What makes the timing even more pointed is that while all of this was being formalized at Sandringham, Prince William apparently had no knowledge of what was unfolding until the sovereign registries his office monitors went dark from the northern end. The digital bridge connecting Kensington Palace to Sandringham for estate management coordination simply went silent. William's staff began making calls. Nobody responded. The king was behind closed doors with his legal team, and the Prince of Wales ultimately made the decision to board a helicopter and fly to Norfolk without the customary 48 hours of advance notice or security preparation. When he landed in heavy rain and moved to access the upper floor of Sandringham, he discovered that his biometric credentials had been removed from the local security registry within the prior 2 hours. An administrative warrant issued directly by the keeper of the privy purse under the king's sovereign prerogative had revoked his access entirely. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. Red light. A flat electronic tone. Access denied. Through the glass panel of the reinforced security door, William could see Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, moving along the inner corridor carrying a sealed leather dispatch case bearing a blue customs tag indicating international diplomatic transit. When William knocked firmly on the glass, Alderton raised a signed executive order mandating complete operational silence and continued walking without pausing. I want to stop here for a moment because this detail is genuinely extraordinary when you sit with it. The future king, the heir to the throne, was physically refused entry to a building he is destined to inherit, watching palace staff carry past him the very documents that would permanently reshape the financial structure of the institution he will one day lead. And his legal inability to intervene is perhaps even more remarkable. William had inadvertently signed the mechanism that made this entire operation possible 2 years earlier during a routine estate restructuring. A cross-lease covering land near Highgrove contained a buried subclause granting the reigning monarch permanent authority to reallocate an equivalent value of non-land assets during any family restructuring event. William had signed it without examining the granular detail. That routine lease became the precise legal instrument Charles needed to execute this sweeping wealth redistribution without administrative resistance. The Prince of Wales had unwittingly handed his father the key used to shut him out. That isn't simply irony. That's estate planning executed at a level of sophistication most law firms couldn't replicate, with a decade of preparation. The witnessing ceremony itself reveals just how carefully the palace legal team had constructed this to withstand any future challenge. Under British law, a sovereign's private will amendment cannot be witnessed by family members, palace employees, or anyone with a beneficial interest in the estate. The witnesses must be entirely neutral. The palace brought in Dame Sarah Aspen, a senior High Court judge, Sir John Baker, Chancellor of the Diocese of Norwich, and Professor David Starkey, a constitutional historian, 3 individuals of unimpeachable standing with no personal stake in the result. All 3 were required to be physically present simultaneously, observe the king execute the document, and add their own signatures in his presence to satisfy the requirements of the Wills Act of 1837. When William entered the room and produced a printed copy of the amendment regulations, demanding an immediate halt on the grounds that reallocation of historical heirlooms required a secondary verification certificate from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the High Court judge quietly informed him that the king had already obtained that certificate during a private London audience 3 days earlier. Every objection had been anticipated. Every procedural avenue had been preemptively closed. The signing itself required less than 3 minutes. King Charles entered at 2:04, supported by a silver-topped walking cane. He did not look at his son. He went directly to the reading desk, retrieved his glasses, sat, and lowered his fountain pen into the inkwell. Once he had signed the foot of the 3rd page, the 3 witnesses followed in quick succession, each signature accompanied by a wax impression from the Sandringham state seal. Not a single word passed between father and son. The document was secured inside the leather dispatch case and became an active legal covenant the instant the final witness completed their signature. Within moments, the internal telephone system rang with an urgent communication from the keeper of the Privy Purse, reporting that the primary accounting terminals in London had automatically locked down 3 major overseas investment files containing the liquid capital reserves of the Duchy of Lancaster. By placing these files under a conditional trust amendment, Charles ensured that his successor cannot access core capital without satisfying restrictive management conditions drafted by the Norwich legal team. A physical bank statement discovered inside a desk drawer revealed that a substantial portion of private offshore wealth had been transferred into a permanent independent endowment fund dedicated exclusively to the maintenance and restoration of historic state apartments at Windsor Castle and Holyrood Palace in Scotland. The private fortune is now permanently bound to the physical preservation of the institution itself. Future monarchs will have guaranteed funding for restoration and structural maintenance. They will not have liquid capital they can redirect for personal purposes. What moved quietly through the upper levels of the British legal establishment in the days that followed was a sober recognition that a threshold had been permanently crossed. The elite law firms specializing in high-level estate management understood immediately what this represented. The palace was no longer attempting to manage internal friction through press strategy, gentle diplomatic briefings, or temporary tactical adjustments. The House of Windsor had elected to deploy the absolute and unyielding authority of property law to enforce structural compliance and operational silence across every branch of the family. Among senior advisors and key royal household figures, a consensus quietly formed that while the speed and secrecy were striking, this had been an unavoidable intervention to neutralize the persistent instability emanating from the California branch. For years, the ongoing friction generated by external commercial activities and public commentary from the younger prince had placed mounting pressure on the long-term credibility and stability of the crown. By bypassing traditional interpersonal mediation and instead encoding firm financial boundaries into irrevocable legal instruments, Charles provided a definitive framework for managing internal crisis going forward. The prevailing view shifted from reading this as a family rift to understanding it as a necessary defensive consolidation of sovereign resources. The transformation in how the monarchy manages its internal dynamics is now total. The old model of spoken understandings and shared family expectations has been entirely superseded by formal trust clauses, strict geographic thresholds, and immutable property deeds. Senior advisors and constitutional scholars noted that the monarchy had chosen to shield itself from future volatility by rendering its core wealth legally impervious to outside pressure. Individual ambition will no longer be permitted to threaten the financial security or historical continuity of the crown. This systematic approach has also fundamentally redefined the role of the heir apparent, recasting the future sovereign not as the unconstrained master of a fluid estate, but as the custodian of a heavily fortified legal architecture. William initially pushed back against these changes, perceiving them as an erosion of the traditional prerogatives of the next in line. But the broader royal establishment views the outcome through a lens of pragmatic necessity. By locking core reserves into dedicated maintenance trusts and imposing rigorous accountability structures, Charles has ensured that whoever sits on the throne in the coming generations will do so with a guaranteed institutional foundation beneath them. The catch is that the foundation arrives with constraints. The future king inherits a crown armored in legal permanence, but he also inherits financial parameters he is powerless to revise. For the California household, the consequences are severe and irreversible. The financial security net that was presumably treated as an unshakable birthright has been subjected to a thorough legal audit, and in the process, the king has installed a permanent trapdoor. The 5-year residency threshold means that even if Harry were to return to the United Kingdom tomorrow and re-establish his primary home there, the 6 years already accumulated abroad have already triggered the disqualification. There is no rehabilitation period. There is no grace clause. The trust language is absolute, and the non-disclosure mechanism means that any legal challenge would expose every commercial activity of the past 5 years to full public examination, every partnership structure, every revenue projection, every tax filing. The palace has essentially said, accept the new reality in silence, or justify your entire business model under oath. That is not a choice most people would willingly make. The reclassification of heirlooms adds another layer of finality. Items understood for decades to be destined for Diana's younger son and his children are now state property residing in the Tower of London. The archive copyright transfer means that accounts of family life from Harry's own adolescent perspective are now administered by William's office. The financial trusts that would have released capital at designated age milestones are now conditioned on geographic requirements that cannot be satisfied from California. Every route back to institutional resources has been methodically sealed, not through angry public statements or emotional confrontations, but through the quiet operation of property deeds, trust amendments, and biometric access revocations. What Charles has achieved, assessed through the unsentimental lens of institutional strategy, is a masterclass in preemptive legal defense. He took a period of acute internal turbulence and used it as the justification for an emergency constitutional maneuver that will safeguard the crown's resources across generations. The era of informal boundaries and emotional compromise within the British monarchy ended on that rain-soaked afternoon at Sandringham. The new reality is codified, ironclad, and entirely immune to public sentiment. The House of Windsor now functions as a tightly governed institution operating by the cold logic of property law. Future sovereigns will ascend not as free-ranging masters of a fluid fortune, but as stewards of a heavily defended legal architecture built to endure for centuries. The quiet acceptance that settled across the corridors of power in London confirmed that the terms of engagement had been rewritten permanently. There is no avenue for future dissent, no mechanism for emotional appeal, no path to legal reversal. The trajectory of the British monarchy is unambiguous. The institution is no longer vulnerable to the unpredictability of personal relationships or shifting family loyalties. It stands protected by an unbreakable legal framework, sovereign, fortified, and entirely self-sufficient. The era of the soft monarchy is closed, and the first casualties of this new order are the expectations of those family members who believed they could operate indefinitely on their own terms outside it.